Mitch, I want to thank you for that nice invitation or introduction, and I want to thank you for the invitation to speak here this morning, and also just want to thank you for the partnership. Like Mitch said, Continuum Ag has been a member of the RFA for the last several years, and we think what Mitch and Continuum are doing and the whole team there is crucially important. It's bold, it's innovative, and it's incredibly important, and it's necessary. If U.S. agriculture and biofuels is to remain competitive worldwide over the long term, we need to be embracing the innovative approaches, the technologies, and the tools that Continuum and others are bringing into the space. So again, really honored to be here this morning. When Mitch and I got together and Diana a couple weeks ago and started talking about potential themes for this presentation, they threw out this one: farmers and biofuels, a time-tested connection. And I thought, man, that's perfect, because the moment we're in today, like Mitch said, we got some things happening in Washington, D.C. as we speak. The moment we're in today is going to require continued collaboration and alignment between us in the renewable fuel space and you in the farming community to make sure we get the best outcomes, the most positive outcomes for everyone involved, and we do remain competitive, and we continue to grow in our respective industries. So with that, I'm going to get started, and I first wanted to just tell you a little bit about the Renewable Fuels Association if you're not familiar with RFA. The best way to describe what we do is we're the voice of the ethanol industry. We've been around since 1981, so really going all the way back to the beginning of the ethanol industry. We're the trade association at the national level that represents ethanol producers, but also vendors and service providers to the industry, companies like Continuum, companies like Eco Engineers, who's on the agenda today, companies like LanzaJet, who's going to be speaking here later this afternoon. So our mission is very simple. It's to drive growth in sustainable renewable fuels and bioproducts for a better future. Drive growth. That's growth in production. That's growth in demand. That's growth in innovation, growth in value. Those are the things we're focused on. We work with all aspects of the supply chain on a wide array of topics. Obviously, public policy, regulatory issues, technical public awareness, educational issues, market development issues. Those are all things we focus on. We have offices in St. Louis, Missouri, and of course in Washington, D.C. As I said, and as Mitch referenced, today in the United States, agriculture and biofuels are inextricably linked. We are joined at the hip, and that's a good thing, and it needs to remain that way. You look at how much demand for U.S. agricultural products comes from biofuels. Today, about 35% of the corn crop, about 5.5 billion bushels, goes into producing ethanol and co-products, distillers' grains, corn oil, other things coming out of our facilities. About 20% of grain sorghum demand comes from biofuels. And the real growth that we've seen in recent years is in the oilseed space. We're seeing about 40 to 45% of soybean oil demand going straight into renewable fuels. So obviously these are hugely important markets for farmers. It was in a discussion last night where the question was asked, what would happen to agriculture if we woke up tomorrow and the ethanol industry was gone? Imagine what that would do to prices, to land values, to machinery sales. We are integrated. We're part of the fabric of agriculture, and we want to continue growing together with agriculture. And I also want to say that every major win we've had, biofuels policy, regulatory, market advances, breaking into new markets, those wins, those victories have occurred because we've been working together with our partners in the farming community. We can't do it by ourselves. You guys can't do it by yourselves. We've got to continue working together. And frankly, as we look toward the future, we believe that the health and welfare of the agriculture industry depends on the health and welfare of renewable fuels and vice versa. We're in this thing together. And to prove that, I want to give a little bit of a history lesson. So bear with me. We've seen time and time again over the last 5 decades that agriculture and biofuels have come together to use biology and chemistry and innovation and technology and nature to solve or address some of society's biggest problems. You can go all the way back to the beginning of the ethanol industry in the late 1970s. What were we dealing with at that time? We had the Arab oil embargo. We had, the energy crisis, gas rationing, high gas prices, shortages, people, waiting in line to get their 2 or 3 gallons of gas to get through the day. Also had the Russian grain embargo at the end of the 70s, early 80s, where we decided to stop exporting grain to Russia. And that backed up in the U.S. system and obviously caused some major pain for U.S. farmers. So to address some of those issues, farmers and grain processors got together, pushed the government to issue what was called a gasohol waiver. That was the first time that E10, 10% ethanol blends were allowed. Congress helped us establish some tax incentives to really encourage blending of renewable fuels. We put a tariff on ethanol imports to make sure that Brazil and other countries didn't swamp our market as we were trying to get this industry off the ground. And we saw some loan programs from DOE and USDA to help get small-scale ethanol production facilities up and running. Those things would not have happened, again, if farmers and grain processors hadn't come together to advocate and lobby the government to get these things done. You flash forward to the 80s and early 90s. Obviously, 80s were a rough time in agriculture, but what was really driving some of the public policy discussion back then was the smog and air quality crisis. You had major cities like Los Angeles where it looked like this every day when you went out on the highway. We had an oil supply glut, very cheap oil, very low gas prices. That made it difficult for alternative energy, things like ethanol and other forms of alternative energy to get up and going. Obviously had the farm crisis. We had massive grain surpluses. We had obviously farm debt, high interest rates, all those problems that you all are well familiar with. So again, we came together, we proposed some solutions, and among those solutions was the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. That was entirely meant to help clean up the smog problem. It worked incredibly well. That program introduced oxygenated fuels and reformulated gasoline. That boosted demand for ethanol. Ethanol as a clean fuel, 35% oxygen, was able to help meet the goals of those programs. Congress also extended the tax incentive for blenders at that time to make sure that there's still a strong economic incentive for them to use ethanol. And then we really began to see states get involved, states like Minnesota, Iowa, others developing their own policies to really stimulate growth in ethanol production and use. Flash forward to the 2000s, the early part of this millennium. Obviously had the 9/11 terror attacks. But what was really driving energy policy at that time was surging dependence on oil imports. At one point around 2003 or 4, we were dependent for about 70% of our petroleum needs came from imports. And Congress and President George W. Bush at that time decided we have got to do something about this. They also saw rising gasoline demand, higher prices at the pump. And at the same time, we began to hear more and more concern about carbon pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we again had several years in the 2000s where we had massive surplus of grain and supply-demand imbalances and very low prices below the cost of production for most farmers. So again, we went to the government together, and I would say this was really the golden era of ethanol renewable fuels policies. We were able to get states to ban the use of MTBE, which was a toxic additive that was being used in reformulated gasoline. The only natural replacement for MTBE was ethanol. That really helped boost demand. And then we got the Renewable Fuel Standard, and we got the first RFS passed in 2005. I was working at the National Corn Growers at that time. 2 years later, we saw that program expanded and extended dramatically in the RFS2. We saw credits for flex fuel vehicles being offered for automakers to build FFEs. Another extension of the tax credit to really spur demand downstream. We saw some state low-carbon fuel standards starting to be developed, namely in California. And then at the end of the decade, we saw an E15 waiver approved by EPA that would allow, or at least make E15 a legal fuel. So that's when we really saw kind of rocket ship growth in ethanol production and demand, was during that period. So kind of bringing this all full circle, and again, thanks for indulging my little history lesson. Here we are today, again, with society facing a lot of the same challenges and a lot of the same concerns: greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, other environmental concerns, sustainability. Obviously, we dealt with the COVID pandemic several years ago, which was quite a shock to the economy globally. We're still dealing with high energy prices and inflation. When you look in historical terms, we're still paying a lot for our energy today. Increasing concerns about energy security. You look at the situation in Russia and Ukraine, Middle East tensions. Energy security continues to be a top priority for countries around the world. And again, you guys went out and planted 95 million acres of corn this year. You know, things seem to be looking pretty good as far as the corn coming up. We're going to have a big crop this year. I know there's a lot of concern about where is that crop going to go. Are we going to be able to find a home for 15 and a half, 16 billion bushels of corn? We have the solution with renewable fuels, and we need to keep pushing that solution. It's worked for the last 40 years. We need to double down and keep expanding renewable fuels. And that's where some of the current policy issues that I'm going to talk about come into play. We saw the Inflation Reduction Act adopted in 2022. That's the law that established the 45Z Clean Fuel Production Credit. It also established the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Credit, 40B, which is now expired. It enhanced and extended 45Q, which is the carbon sequestration credit. We also saw the government adopt what they called a SAF Grand Challenge to really push the development and commercialization of sustainable aviation fuels. And then our old friend, the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard, is still driving growth and demand in renewable fuels and boosting demand by extension for farm products, corn and soybeans in particular. So these are some of the current policy issues I'm going to talk about. I'm going to finish with 45Z because I know that's the issue that you all are most concerned and interested in. But again, if you look throughout those past 5 decades and the history that I just walked through, one of the consistent challenges that we have been dealing with is overabundance in agriculture in this country. And I hate to talk about productivity as a problem. That's ridiculous. You want to be productive. You want to be efficient. You want to continue improving your efficiency and productivity. But it's a double-edged sword. And if we're not keeping demand in balance with that increasing supply, it's not a sustainable situation. So this is one of those things that continues to be a driver for renewable fuels policy overall, is just making sure that we are creating new market opportunities and new value opportunities for agriculture. This just kind of hammers that home. I think this looks at the last 100 years, and this is just the percent change in corn production going back to 1926. That's the orange line. So we're producing 628% more corn in the United States today than we did 100 years ago, and we're doing it on 5% less land. That's the blue line at the bottom. I mean, if that is not the definition of efficiency and sustainability, I don't know that there is one. I mean, that in one picture shows the incredible story of productivity and efficiency in the U.S. corn industry. And then the table off to the side, again, I think underscores that biofuels have helped keep demand pretty well in balance or in line with supply growth. If you look at 2001 and 2023 in that chart, you see that in 2001 we produced 9.5 billion bushels of corn. 2023, 15.3 billion bushels. So 6 billion bushels more produced in 2023 than in 2021. Go the next line down. How much of that was used for ethanol? We used less than 1 billion bushels of corn for ethanol in 2001. and 5.5 billion bushels in 2023. So supply grew by 6 billion bushels. Demand for ethanol grew by 5 billion bushels. Again, helping keep supply and demand in balance. How are we going to do that moving forward? How are we going to continue to ensure that we're able to keep supply and demand in balance? How are we going to continue creating new market opportunities for the increased production that is coming from U.S. farms? One way is through E15. Today, just about every gallon of gas in the country has 10% ethanol in it. More and more stations are offering 15% blends, E15. But the reason it's not the new norm or the standard today is because in most parts of the country, you still can't sell, retailers can't sell E15 for 3.5 months a year because of a 35-year-old antiquated EPA regulation that never made any sense. And so we've been working diligently for the past few years to try and get that changed. It's going to require an act of Congress. It's going to require a law to give retailers the ability to sell year-round E15 nationwide. And so that remains our top priority. It's a simple legislative fix. The bill's been introduced many times. It's about a 2.5-page bill. It's again, should do the trick very well. It would allow E15 to be treated the same way as E10 in the marketplace. And guess what? It's actually supported by the American Petroleum Institute because they're tired of dealing with this seasonal market on E15. They would rather just have it be consistent and available nationwide as well, along with retailers and farm groups and others. So there's a broad support. There's bipartisan support in Congress for getting this done. We nearly got it done in December as part of that continuing resolution bill, but this language got stripped out at the very last minute along with all of the other extras and policy riders that were in that big CR bill. So now we're looking for new vehicles, new legislative vehicles to move this legislation. It's not going to move by itself. Nothing does today. It seems like when Congress does anything, it's as part of a big package. So we're looking for ways to get E15 legislation across the goal line yet this year so we don't have this problem every spring and summer. We're also pushing EPA to revive a proposal that it put out back in 2020 or 2021 that would make it a lot easier for retailers to sell E15 through their existing equipment. Right now, a lot of retailers have been led to believe, man, I got to put new tanks in or I got to put new dispensers in. Bottom line is most of that stuff that's already in the field is perfectly compatible with E15. But again, the regulations need to catch up to that and allow them to use that existing equipment. If we could sell E15 in the existing equipment and we had the ability to do it year-round, I guarantee you overnight you would see this market nationwide flip to E15 very quickly. We're also pushing on California. They are the one remaining state that does not allow the sale of E15. They got to do things their way, which is pretty typical for California. They have their own process, their own approval process. We're going through that now and expect that they will be allowing the sale of E15 beginning in 2027. Why do we spend so much time on E15? I know a lot of people ask that. Here's the reason. This chart shows what gasoline consumption in the U.S. is projected to do in the next 15, 20 years. It's going to fall. I think there's pretty broad agreement on that. How fast and how far it falls, I think, is the subject of debate, but I think most people agree that long-term we are going to see a reduction in gasoline consumption in the United States. Why is that? Well, we're all driving more fuel-efficient vehicles. They get more miles to the gallon. You've also got electrification, more electric vehicles kind of encroaching into the fleet. That's going to have an impact on demand long term. And if you believe the Energy Information Administration, they say by 2030 we're going to be down to about 130 billion gallons of consumption annually and then fall to below 100 billion gallons annually by 2040. Remember, that's the fuel that we blend ethanol into. So if that's declining, that means our market share is potentially declining as well, unless we're able to get a larger share of that gas tank. And that's what E15 does for us. That blue dotted line shows, hey, if we just keep things where they're at 10.3% of the gas pool, we're going to see significant demand erosion for ethanol. We're going to go from about 14.2 billion gallons blended into the domestic market to less than 10 billion gallons by 2040. Think of how much corn demand loss that is. That would be devastating. That orange line shows, hey, if we get to half the market is E15 by 2030, and then we get to full penetration by 2040, we not only hold the line, we actually see some growth in ethanol consumption domestically. But if we're able to get to 100% penetration sooner than that, if we're able to get the market flipped over to E15 nationwide by 2030, that could be a significant demand boost in the short term for ethanol. You need as much as 19 billion gallons of ethanol to satisfy E15 nationwide by 2030. That's why we think this is so important. One other thing I want to point out is, I think our industry has maybe done ourselves a disservice by trying to market E15 as something new and different and better and greener and giving it, clever marketing names. What retailers are telling us today, and this is a photo from a Casey's station, I think here in Iowa, they're telling us what we're finding is consumers don't want something different and new. They don't want a new choice or a new option at the pump. They don't want to be confused. They don't want to spend another minute at the gas station figuring out, is this okay for my car? What is this? What is 88 octane? They want the same thing. And so we're seeing a lot of retailers now marketing E15 to look just like E10. And even though it's 88 octane, they're labeling it as 87. And then the price speaks for itself. And so we're seeing this model really take off and drive some growth and demand at some of the bigger retail stations. Casey's is doing it this way. Love's, Pilot, some of the other big guys. And this is not just one dispenser at their locations. They're replacing E10 with E15 in nearly all of their dispensers under the canopy. That's how we're going to move volume. I want to shift gears to the Renewable Fuel Standard briefly. Again, I've talked about how important the RFS has been to the industry over the past 20 years. It remains vitally important to the industry. It creates that demand floor for biofuels. We are expecting the proposed volumes for 2026 and 27 any day. Frankly, we think this week we will see that proposal from EPA, and we have been working very hard along with, again, believe it or not, the American Petroleum Institute, the corn growers, the Soybean Association, Farm Bureau, retailers, many others, to keep boosting those volumes under the RFS. We've been telling EPA and the administration we need higher volumes, again, to support the growth in demand and again, provide an outlet for the massive crops that you all are producing in agriculture. We do expect final rules. Like I said, we'll see a proposed rule for these volumes any day, but we expect final rules by the end of October this year. All right, so getting to 45Z, and again, I know this is why most of you are here, is to talk about where we're at with 45Z. I think most of you know what 45Z is. The Clean Fuel Production Credit it's part of the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022. It was meant to stimulate investment in the production of lower carbon fuels, especially aviation fuel, and I think that often gets overlooked at times. One of the reasons we were able to get this tax credit included is because there was a lot of support from lawmakers outside of the Midwest who saw a real need to help decarbonize aviation fuel. So coastal Democrats, coastal lawmakers who don't care as much as Midwestern lawmakers do about corn and soybeans, but they joined with us to get this tax credit done because they care about reducing emissions from aviation. This credit, I think you know how it works. It provides anywhere from 10 cents to $1 per gallon based on the carbon intensity of the fuel. You got to be below a certain threshold to begin generating credit, and I'll walk through that in a minute. Aviation fuels obviously get a higher value. They get basically a 1.75 multiplier for aviation fuels. That bottom point is very critical, and we're learning from talking with ethanol producers that meeting the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements under this law is proving challenging in many locations. And if you don't meet those requirements, the value of your credit gets cut by 80%, which is a big deal. So this is what it looks like. And again, I think there's been some confusion. Does every point of CI generate a penny or 2 cents? In theory, that's how it should have worked, but because of the way the law was written and the rounding conventions that are in the legislation, it breaks down that you're in 10-cent brackets, basically. So for every 5 kilograms of CO2 per million BTUs that you're reducing, you're getting a 10-cent kind of stair-step credit. Again, the orange bars show if you're not meeting prevailing wage requirements, the value of that credit is much, much lower than if you are meeting prevailing wage. This is where, if you open up the GREET model that DOE published back in January, and you just say, what does an average kind of typical corn ethanol plant look like? It gives you a CI score of around 52.5 kilograms of CO2 per million BTUs. Again, I just showed that the threshold to begin generating credit is at 47.5. So you look at that and you say, well, most corn ethanol plants, or many corn ethanol plants, are just on the outside. They're not able to generate credit today just based on kind of the status quo conditions. The other thing I'd point out here is you look at that, the biggest chunk of the carbon footprint for corn ethanol, according to GREET, it's the feedstock production. It's 27 kilograms of CO2 per million BTUs. That's what the emissions from farming, they're saying, make up half of that carbon footprint for corn ethanol. So how do we get below that red line and start generating credit? Obviously, if you're an ethanol producer, if you have the ability to harness carbon capture and sequestration, you can completely wipe out the emissions related to converting corn into ethanol at the ethanol facility. So that would knock you down 25 or 30 points if you're able to do CCS. And then obviously, for everybody in the room, you all know that CSA, adopting climate smart ag practices for the feedstock, can completely eliminate the emissions related to the feedstock side. I mean, we just heard somebody up here had a negative 21. I mean, that's 50 points lower than what GREET, what DOE is assuming is kind of the average across the U.S. today. So we can get from 52.5 kilograms to 0 or below for corn ethanol if we have the ability to harness CSA and if we have access to carbon capture and sequestration. Having access, getting access to or climate smart agriculture practices was a top priority for Secretary Tom Vilsack when he was serving as Secretary of Ag at USDA. He's the one who single-handedly worked and worked and worked to ensure that there would be an ability for ag practices to be included and represented in carbon intensity modeling for 45Z. It wasn't perfect. It took longer than he wanted it to, but they did get a package out, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Again, we know that farming, the feedstock production, represents about half of that overall carbon footprint. So everybody understands the importance of being able to adopt lower carbon farming practices to get that CI score down. In 2024, the Treasury Department, when they were doing the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Credit, 40B, they included a CSA pilot program. They called it a pilot program, and basically said if farmers are doing 3 bundled practices, very prescriptive, no-till cover crops and efficient nitrogen fertilizers, then they would get, the SAF producer would get a 10 gram per megajoule deduction or credit off their CI score if they could prove that they used feedstock that was produced using those practices. Obviously, that was not a perfect solution, not even close to it, but it was a start, and it was really the first time ever that we had the ability to integrate unique farming practices into a carbon scoring regulation and tax program. USDA said, hey, we know we have a lot of work to do, we have a lot of room for improvement on this thing, and we're going to get it right under 45Z. So they set down that path to get it right for 45Z, but guess what? An election happened, things changed, politics changed, work streams got sped up, and so in January, about a week before the inauguration, the Treasury Department and USDA and DOE they all rushed out, pushed out their pieces of the 45Z package. For Treasury, since this is their program, they put out their notice of intent on how this is all going to work. USDA put out their climate smart ag guidelines and a carbon intensity scoring calculator, and then DOE released the 45Z CF GREET model. So they dumped all these puzzle pieces out on the table, and then they left town because the Trump administration was coming in and sort of handed this all over to the incoming administration. And that new administration, the Trump administration, has not picked those pieces up. It really hasn't done anything with the package that was left to it by the Biden administration. And we don't have a clear timeline around when they're going to do that. And one of the reasons for that is when we go to talk to Treasury and say, hey, when are you guys going to get on the ball and get going on 45Z? They say, not until Congress is done doing whatever they're going to do. And that's the process that's playing out right now. You've got Congress, as they're debating budget reconciliation and the big, beautiful bill, they are taking a whack at reforming 45Z. And we've already seen the House provide their version of what that reform looks like, and I'll mention that here in a second. But these are the individual pieces that were sort of laid out on the table that are yet to be assembled. And again, going back to my opening, we have got to be working together, farm groups, ethanol groups, everybody with an interest in this program, to encourage these agencies and to encourage our friends in Congress to get this done. Put those pieces together, give us a program that works for agriculture and works for biofuels. This is where we're at. The House, 2 weeks ago, passed what they call the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Of course, it does lots and lots and lots of things, but specific for us, it does include some important 45Z reforms. And going into this process, you got to remember, we were worried that all the Inflation Reduction Act programs were going to get gored. They were going to get cut. A lot of them did. In fact, many of them did. They accelerated the expiration for many of those IRA programs. They didn't do that for 45Z. And in fact, they extended 45Z in this bill by 4 years. And again, that's a reflection of the bipartisan support that we have for this program and the effective job that we've done together advocating for 45Z. So what the House bill does is it provides that extension. It also removes indirect land use change emissions from those emissions rates. And if you remember that bar chart I showed, there's about nearly 10% of ethanol's carbon score it comes from these supposed indirect land use change emissions. And again, this is the theory that, well, if we're using more corn and soybeans for biofuels, that means we're going to be expanding cropland and farmers are going to be plowing up, pristine prairie and chopping trees down, and there's a carbon cost associated with that. And so we got to stick that on this carbon score. We've always maintained that that's ridiculous when you look at what's happening in the real world. At least in North America, we're seeing no evidence of that kind of land use change. And so the House lawmakers agreed with us and said, you know what, we're going to take indirect land use change out of that equation. So that immediately lowers everybody's carbon score by about 5 or 6 kilograms, which is a big deal. It also would prohibit the use of, or prohibit from eligibility, fuels that are made from crops that are grown anywhere outside of North America. And this was primarily to address a lot of the concerns that we were hearing around used cooking oil from China and other feedstock imports that may not have really been what they were advertised to be. So the House said, okay, fine, we're just going to cut that off and we're going to focus on North American feedstocks. And after all, this is a U.S. taxpayer based program, so we shouldn't be subsidizing the importation of feedstocks from other countries. It also eliminates transferability of those credits after 2027. That's the one piece of this House package that we don't like. That makes it much harder for individual producers to monetize the tax credit unless they have form a legal tax equity partnership. And I know you're going to be hearing from some tax experts a little later this morning that can delve into that, I'm sure. Frustratingly, the prevailing wage requirements also remain in place. The House, we're encouraging them to strike that out of there. They weren't able to do that. This all now moves to the Senate. And so really starting today, the Senate is going to be taking up its discussions around the Big Beautiful Bill Act. And the Senate Finance Committee in particular is going to be looking at what do we want to do with 45Z? Do we want to take what the House did and run with it? Do we want to make additional changes to it? You know, what are the cost implications of this? We're trying to reduce spending. So those questions, those debates are going to be happening this week and probably next week in the Senate. We'll have a much clearer picture of how this all looks, I think, by the end of this week or certainly early next week. Bear in mind that any changes Congress makes, if you know, the Senate does something to 45Z and they can agree on the House, agree with the House on what those changes are, and it goes to the President's desk, well, now it all goes back to the Treasury and IRS for a new rulemaking. And depending on how different this might look from the current 45Z program, we could be in for more delays and, you know, 6 or 9 more months of uncertainty around what this program is going to look like. I did want to show just very briefly what the impact of removing indirect land use change is on various feedstocks and biofuels. Again, I got that 47.5 threshold. I mean, if you're above that, you're not generating credit. If you're below it, you begin generating credit. And the closer you get to zero, obviously, the higher the credit is. For so-called waste feedstocks, tallow, used cooking oil, distillers corn oil, removing ILUC has no impact because they were not assessed any indirect land use change effect to begin with. But when you look at canola was on the outside looking in. If ILUC is removed in the final bill that comes out of the Senate, as it was in the House, now they're in the game. They go from being on the outside of 45Z to being in kind of the 10 or 20 cent per gallon range. Same with renewable diesel and SAF made from canola. You can also see the big benefit to biodiesel and renewable diesel made from soybean oil. I mean, it virtually doubles their credit value simply by pulling land use change emissions out. And then for corn, like I showed earlier, a lot of corn ethanol is just on the outside, just above that 47.5. Cutting land use change gets most corn ethanol, kind of typical corn ethanol, just inside the door. And then if we're able to adopt CCS, and then if we're able to adopt CSA, we keep working closer and closer to zero. What removing land use change does not do, if you look at the far right side, is it doesn't get SAF made from corn ethanol under that threshold. So if you're taking corn ethanol and making it into alcohol to jet fuel, you're still not there because of the extra energy and emissions associated with taking corn ethanol and making it into jet fuel. And I want to finish just by talking about jet fuel real quick. This is what the long-term projection on demand for jet fuel in the U.S. looks like. That's the blue line at the top. You know, close to 30 billion gallons of jet fuel consumption by 2040. And the orange line we put on just to show what the potential for alcohol to jet would be. If alcohol to jet, SAF, represented just 20% of total jet fuel demand in the U.S. by 2030, that would create a market for nearly 9 billion gallons of ethanol. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's, you know, 8.7 is not 20% of 27.3. That's because it takes 1.7 gallons of ethanol to make 1 gallon of SAF. You've got to remove that oxygen. So that's 35% of the mass of the fuel has to be removed, and you go through dehydration and a whole process to make SAF. So it's more than a one-for-one exchange. If by 2040, 40% of the market is ethanol-based SAF, that's a 20 billion gallon, 19, 20 billion gallon market that we do not have today. This is why SAF is so important. This is why we got to get it right. Unfortunately, we don't think 45Z gets it quite right for SAF. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. But there are some challenges for SAF under the way 45Z is structured. And I'm not going to go through this. I'll just skip right to the example here. And I believe LanzaJet may be addressing some of this later today. But if you're an ethanol producer and you make 100 million gallons of ethanol for blending with motor gasoline and the CI value is 25, you can sell that fuel and you can claim the 45Z credit, be about 50 cents a gallon. That'd be 50 million in revenue to your facility. If instead a SAF producer calls you up and says, hey, I want to buy your 100 million gallons of 25 CI ethanol, you're going to tell that SAF producer, well, I can get 50 cents a gallon if I sell it to a blender, so you need to pay me a 50-cent premium at least for me to sell this ethanol to you. So say that happens. Then the SAF producer takes that ethanol and they take that 100 million gallons and that becomes 59 million gallons of alcohol to jet, because again, it takes more ethanol, more than 1 gallon to make a gallon of SAF. Because of the extra emissions associated with that processing, their CI goes from a 25 up to a 45, and that credit is now only worth 18 cents a gallon. So you went from a 50-cent per gallon credit if you're using this fuel, to blend with gasoline, to an 18-cent credit on a smaller volume if you're making this fuel into SAF, and the numbers just don't work. So there's clearly some fixes, some improvements that need to happen with 45Z as it relates to SAF if we really want 45Z to stimulate SAF demand. There's some good ideas out there on how to do that, and we've been talking with the Senate and others on that. This is my last slide, and again, this is where I want to kind of bring things full circle. 45Z represents a huge opportunity for your industry, for our industry, for the entire supply chain. We got to get it right. We got to continue working together. We got to continue making the case that we have a solution to bring to the table, just as we have over the past 50 years. We got to stay at the table. We got to stay actively engaged. We need to be calling our elected officials, especially in the Senate this week, and telling them these are our priorities for 45Z. From our perspective, we still need to get rid of the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. That, in many cases, that's a poison pill for a lot of producers. Maintaining credit transferability, I talked about the rounding issue. Would prefer to see every point of CI rewarded rather than, well, you got to get, kind of chunks of 5 grams at a time. Zero or low land use change emissions. The House went about it with a little bit of a heavy hand, but we agree that there is really no scientific justification for land use change emissions to be included, at least for North American crops. We do want to make sure we're preventing imports of fraudulent feedstocks, things like so-called used cooking oil from China that is actually palm oil. We want to make darn sure that the Senate is thinking about integrating a fair and workable CSA program into 45Z and really holding Treasury's feet to the fire to make sure that gets done. Talked about ATJ and the importance of making sure we get it right with SAF, including carbon utilization, not just CCS in CI scoring, and then extension. This program that was adopted by Congress expires at the end of 2027. That's not much time. That's a year and a half away. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment needed to build a new SAF facility, or tens of millions of dollars for an ethanol plant to adopt technologies to lower CI. The House said, hey, we're going to try and give you 4 more years. That's a good start. But if this program's truly going to transform transportation fuels and help decarbonize on-road and aviation transportation, we need a longer runway. And so we're going to be pushing for an extension, and certainly the Senate, our friends in the Senate understand that. So those are our priorities as this bill moves to the Senate. Certainly appreciate your support and working together to advocate for those priorities and push for those priorities. Like I said, we've been incredibly successful working together over the past 50 years. We've built an industry from the ground up. We've built demand for 5.5 billion bushels of corn from nothing. Let's continue working together to build that next 5.5, next 6 billion bushels of demand. So thank you very much.